You're very welcome to the Firm and Fast Golf Podcast. I'm your host, Shane Darby. A recent visit to Walton Heath Golf Club afforded me an opportunity to pay a visit to one of the doyens of British golf history, none other than Philip Truett himself. Philip was very gracious in extending me an audience with him at his home Walton Cottage, which is a mere stone's throw from the first tee on the old course at Walton Heath Golf Club. This episode is the latest instalment of our ODG Series, where we take a look at historical figures in golf in more detail. On this occasion, we focus on William Herbert Fowler. Philip recently co-authored a book in conjunction with Derek Markham on W.H. Fowler, and as much as we tried to stay on topic, and to be fair, we mainly did get back towards Fowler and his story, we also meandered into fruitful topics such as greens committees, the appointment of course architects, the distance debate, and other related gold. Philip is an absolute gent. Spending time in his company is a great honour and indeed an education. If you ever do get the opportunity, you must seize the moment. Many thanks to Philip for his time, to you for listening. We really do hope you enjoy our chat on all things William Herbert Fowler. Philip Truett, you're very welcome to the Firm and Fast Golf Podcast. How are you?
I feel very honoured to have such a honour bestowed upon me. Thank you very much for coming.
Well, first of all, thank you for having me. We're sitting here in the library at Walton Cottage, just on site at Walton Heath. Thankfully playing a game later on the old course for the first time. So it behooved me to have a chat with your good self and learn a little bit more about, as Angela Moser called Herbert Fowler, the erratic genius. So perhaps, maybe as a starting point, you might, and first of all, many congratulations to yourself and Derek Markham for the fantastic book, A Matter of Course. I devoured that recently in preparation for today. Maybe you might give us a little bit of a background on the sort of people that Fowler was from and how that influenced his life and his career and the opportunities that presented themselves.
Yeah, an amazing chap. And of course, in researching the history, or more correctly, his life, and a huge amount of credit in this respect obviously goes to Derek Markham, the author. We just learnt so much more about him as a man, and he was the most remarkable man. He was born into a gilded age. I learnt a lot more. Well, pretty well everything I know about Quakers is as a result of that what became Derek's first chapter, which you may recall doesn't even mention golf, but it's all to do with the Quakers. And he was the eldest son of an immensely wealthy Quaker family, and they were the banking Quakers. And of course, because they were sort of ostracized from polite society, the Quakers very much kept to themselves, but they did a lot of business between themselves. And I suppose it would be correct in saying that with his birth, which was in the mid-1850s, the Quakers weren't being quite as persecuted as they had been. And I think it was an uncle of his actually became the first ever MP, Quaker MP. But he was educated privately. They didn't go to the great public schools or the great universities, very much educated privately and at home. And I mean, to give you some sort of idea of the gilded life that he led, his first job, and he had travelled to Australia. He was a very keen cricketer. So he'd done what would I suppose be called a gap year or 2 or 3. And of course, he always maintained that he was on that original touring party. Was it? I'm now going into cricket history. I might get this wrong. Was it Lord Hawke had his first touring party? But there was never any evidence.
That was the one down to Australia.
Yeah. And actually, I think perhaps this might expose a little bit of a flaw in Herbert Fowler, whereby he was inclined to tell the odd tale that was quite difficult to substantiate later on.
We have a saying in Ireland: never let the truth stand in the way of a good story.
Yes. Yeah. Because I think that, because when he went over got out to America, I'm dodging way forward now, in 1920, the first Englishman or anybody from this part of the world to get to the West Coast, any golf course architect to get to the West Coast, he used to brag about being on that touring side. And I think perhaps that touring side visited San Francisco on the way home. Would that have been possible? But anyway, he sort of impressed them with that. But Derek and I have never, ever found any evidence of him actually playing on that. Okay, he might have been there and he might have saw that first cricket team playing in Australia, but there's no evidence. So anyway, his first job, he was given a bank. And it can't be too many people whose first job is
at 22 years of age.
Something like that, yes. Yeah. Good that you've been reading the book. I expect you remember more about it than me. And, he lived in great style. He had a big house outside Bideford, and the firm was called Fox Fowler. And he had the big house, and he did all the right things that you do if you have the big house just outside the town and you're the local banker. So good for business, although I doubt if he was seen behind the counter very often looking after the good people of
Taunton.
I was about to say Saunton.
That's okay.
Sorry about that.
Well, he did that. He did that as well.
He did that as well, yeah.
But there's actually a sentence in the book which I'd like to just share with you, just to remind you. So, needless to say, when he was looking for the job, and he obviously ultimately got the job in the bank, it says where he could use his qualities of good fellowship and extrovert nature while earning enough money to maintain a lifestyle with an agreeable blend of congenial work allied to sporting endeavour.
Where'd you get that from? It's in the book.
In the book.
But is it somebody's quote, or just Derek?
No, it's Derek.
Derek Markham's quote. Yeah, well, he's very good at all the English, Derek. Having been properly educated. So he had the big house and he had the prize-winning herd of cattle. He showed at Chelsea Flower Show. He entertained the local hunt. He did all this. And actually, in those really early days, played a bit of golf at Royal North Devon, Westwood Ho, but didn't sort of take it up. He had other things to do, and he was playing cricket. He had a lot to do with Somerset cricket becoming one of the established counties. He had played cricket for Essex. So that was his priority in those days. And the proper golf came a bit later, if you like, after his cricketing career.
Could we just linger on his cricketing career for a second? He was an all-rounder, I believe.
Yeah.
And a destructive batsman.
Yeah.
And when the mood took him, no one was safe. Windows and all sorts of stuff. He was renowned for his big hitting.
Yeah.
Both at cricket and golf, ultimately.
Yeah. And famously hit the ball over the pavilion at Lord's. Although, as one of my cricketing friends did point out, that in those days the pavilion wasn't quite as tall as it is now, but it was still a tremendously long shot.
It's still that far away, though.
Yeah.
And obviously, he would go on to have a history of, I guess, election to the MCC and the RNA ultimately, and from an administrative perspective, quite a big influence both through cricket and golf and billiards as well, I believe.
Yeah, that's right. But I think being born into that sort of rarefied atmosphere that he was, it gave him a huge amount of self-confidence. The one thing that Herbert Fowler never lacked was confidence in himself. And I think that enabled, the whole pack of cards came tumbling down through quick to hasten to add that it was through no fault. It was another family member, one of the Pease family, Pease, famous banking family, who were part of the Fowler family. And he in the 1890s had given a lot of personal guarantees, which was not a sensible thing to do. So young Herbert, having had this marvellous gilded lifestyle down in Taunton, suddenly had to find something to do. And that's much the same sort of time that he was starting to play golf. And he had a brother-in-law here, Sir Cosmo Bonza, who he was already owing money. They married sisters, and he was the big landowner here at Kingswood Warren, and then bought up Walton Heath. But all of this gave him a sort of tremendous amount of confidence. So whatever he did subsequently, he dominated everything. And I mean, classically, I think any sort of evidence of this is when he first of all joined the RNA, which I think was 1894, because he appears in that wonderful picture of all the members standing outside watching A.J. Balfour drive in as captain in 1894. And there over on the right-hand side, so he was a new member, and it wasn't everybody that got into the picture. I mean, they would have all been painted individually, and then the artist put them all together on this magnificent canvas. And who's he close by but H.S. Colt? And I can't help feeling they must have both been talking about laying out golf courses, but who knows? But the extraordinary thing is, so you're a new member in 94, and I think, was it 4 years later in 98 that he had this filibuster at a business meeting, what we call a business meeting, where there was nothing on the agenda, but somehow not only did he raise it, but he got it agreed that the secretary should be paid by the club for being the secretary. Previously, it was the Grace family, local solicitors, who'd done it as an honorary job for, even then, way over 100 years, I think. So to have the confidence, just think of yourself as having joined this august club, and 4 years later, still as quite a young chap, you take over a general meeting and get the rule changed. And of course, they were all, after the meeting, and there were an awful lot of people up in arms about it, but the very charming Mr. Grace said, "Oh dear, no, well, if only somebody had told me, I'd be perfectly happy to stand on one side." So thanks to the honorary secretary being terribly nice about it, I expect he might have actually been relieved. Who knows? Never thought of that, really. So Fowler prevailed, and then, whatever he did, and you've mentioned billiards even, and he was the chap that you asked to sort of run things, because he could sort of, I would guess, dominate proceedings.
Yeah. Benevolent dictator, maybe.
Yeah.
So going back to, obviously, he would retire from playing cricket and needed an outlet for his sporting endeavours.
Yeah.
And I believe, as I think you pointed out, he was taken to play golf in Westward Ho back in 1879, obviously while still playing cricket. Yeah. I think he retired from county cricket due to sunstroke in 1885, and his cousin actually would bring him to the old course in St Andrews. I think he was a member of the RNA. Is that right?
What, another Fowler cousin?
Another Fowler cousin.
Did you pick that up in the book?
Yeah.
So I must have forgotten that bit.
That's all right. But I guess really what I'm getting at is, as a beginner, obviously, as we were all beginners, it takes some time to master the skill. But Jesus, he seemed to master it pretty quickly, and to some level.
Mm. I think that for those really early days at Westward Ho, didn't he, and we're only just talking about a very short period of time, didn't he reckon to get to scratch? Yeah,
pretty quickly.
Extraordinary.
Yeah.
And then actually talking about his subsequent career at Westward Ho, there's an early history of theirs, the anthology put together by, forget his name for the moment. Anyway, the first, so this published, an anthology published in the 70s, I think, 1970s. They had a record of all the club competitions in the back, and I collated, actually I even found one mistake, collated all of Fowler's results. And there was one short period of time, and these were open competitions, and I think to this day a lot of the Westward Ho tournaments are open, because in those days there weren't that many people playing, and there was a almost like a tour, a grouping of wealthy amateur golfers who used to go round playing in all these open competitions. So he wasn't just beating his local members, but beating a lot of other people at the same time. And he had a tremendous record down there. And again, the dates escape me, but I think I'm talking about 08, sort of years just before the Great War, playing tremendously good golf. And of course, he was in the first England team to play against Scotland. Or was it the second time? But anyway, and this is what must have impressed his brother-in-law, Cosmo Bonza, who saw this brother-in-law out of a job, but doing a lot of good stuff on the golf course. And he'd got this huge piece of land where he wanted to put a golf course, not because he was a keen golfer, but he wanted people on his railway line. And he'd gone to a huge amount of expense. He was chairman of one of the railway companies and gone to a huge amount of expense to get the train out to Kingswood and then on to Tadworth and then finally on to Tatton Corner for the racing. And he just wanted more people on the railway line. And when you think of the old course at Walton Heath being Fowler's first attempt at laying out a golf course, I mean, he had 600 acres of land to play with. So he spotted the land that was most appropriate. And I would guess with the passage of time, his ability to see a golf course on very often a very unlikely piece of land was his greatest talent. And when I wrote to so many of the current golf course architectures and the students of golf course architecture about what were Fowler's greatest attributes, and I think this kept coming up. You know, if you think of the North Course at the LA Country Club, amazing piece of land, but would many of people actually spotted that as being appropriate? And the sadness now is that they never give him credit. It's all George Thomas.
Well, Jeff Shackelford made that point as a quote in the book that basically says, I think there's 11 or 12 of the corridors in the North Course are still Fowler's, but he doesn't get anywhere near the level of recognition that he deserves. Yeah. Interestingly, just apropos the site at Walton Heath, I believe he surveyed it on horseback.
Yeah. The great joy about Walton in this respect is that Country Life published a book, Golf Greens and Greenkeeping, in, I think I'm right in saying 06, so only a couple of years afterwards, and they gave him the chapter of building a golf course on a piece of heathland. So, you know, what he tells us there is still very, very fresh in his mind.
And I think it was Carter's, the seed purveyors or suppliers, they suggested, and again, you can correct me if I'm wrong, that Walton Heath was the first golf course to be fully sown with grass seed.
That's right. And they made a lot of it. You know, they used it.
They were obviously the supplier.
Advertising, yes. I think I'm right in saying that when it came to certainly the second 9 holes on the new course, so they built and again, this is the free-thinking Fowler coming in, because people didn't have more than 18 holes. In fact, in 1904, when this was open, 1903, the club was started, but we know that he was planning it back in 1899, 1900. There were so many courses that had 9 holes. In fact, might it be correct in suggesting that the vast majority of courses in the 1890s were 9 holes? I'm not sure if anybody's ever done that statistic, but an awful lot were 9 holes. And there was he with his 18 holes, and within 2 years, they'd opened what was a second golf course. 9 holes only, and all those 9 holes are within the confines of the old course, so there was no more land needed, where they owned all the land here. But it is common land with rights of common, and they had issues with expanding the second 9 to 18 holes. They had to go out into new territory, and it took another 7 years to get that second 9 open. And I'm telling you all of that because coming back to the fact that by then he'd realized the natural heathland grasses grew, and I don't think they seeded the second 9.
Wow.
Can you check on that? Have you come across that?
I haven't come across that, but I will check it for you.
Yeah.
It's quite remarkable in that, and I admit, obviously, a familiar connection with Cosmo Bonzer. But he was given carte blanche to basically do whatever he wanted to. You know, made secretary and managing director.
Yeah.
Off you go.
Yeah. Yeah.
Admittedly, obviously, a golfer of some repute.
Yeah.
But had never undertaken anything like that before.
And then thinking of those days when he had so much money, he thought he should build a property adjacent to the club, and got Lutchins, the absolute prime architect of the day, to build this magnificent...
This is Chussex.
Chussex. Yeah. Wonderful. And in fact, this cottage that we're in here, which is now called Walton Cottage, which was originally called The Bungalow, became Little Chussex. This was called Little Chussex because this was the little property at the bottom of his garden. But Fowler, he should never, ever have built that great big house because he was never, ever going to be able to afford to live in it. And needless to say, you know, he had to sell it not so long after it was built. But he still had these wonderful ideas that he could lead the life when actually he didn't have the money. When we found an old metal trunk of his, deed box in the clubhouse, down in the cellars, it had all these bills from every conceivable top London firm, and they all started with account rendered. In other words, this is over from the last one, and this is what you haven't paid for the last one. And he owed everybody in London money, and all of those, they're readily available in the History Centre at Woking, because we decided that all his non-golfing stuff, good social history stuff, was more safely deposited at the local History Centre. So really all the material pertaining to the club, the club becoming a members club in 1971, and a lot of Fowler stuff that was entirely personal is there available for people to see.
Just to bring you back to when he was surveying the site and apropos the utilisation of the natural contours and whatever he found, I believe that he integrates some natural geological faults into the design of the golf course, or courses, shall we say. And also, I was interested to see that he used G.A. Franks and Company as the contractor. Needless to say, Franks Harris Brothers are related to that, or certainly are an offshoot, or became essentially G.A. Franks became the Franks of Franks Harris Brothers, who obviously Cope would use extensively in terms of his construction efforts. So I'm just wondering if you can sort of maybe tell us a little bit about those geological faults. No, I think it's solution hollows.
Solution, yes, because for years it was an extraordinary thing, because I was just putting on one side before you came an article that I stumbled across, or somebody else stumbled across and sent it to me, and this was some huge drive that Hambro hit down what is now the 14th of the Old, which used to be the 15th. And of course, they teed it up just beside the 13th green, and his foursomes partner couldn't have hit actually such a good drive, because he refers to the first Roman kitchen, because just where that green is, currently the 13th green and the third green on the new course, there was a big Roman villa, big Roman villa there. And in days gone by, these holes in the ground were either Roman kitchens or Roman stables. That's another one. I remember an archaeologist coming to sort of look at the place, and we were walking around together, and he said, well, have you ever tried to get a horse to go into a hole in the ground? I mean, it's crazy. And as for the kitchen, that's another thing. No, these are solution hollows. They're natural geological faults, and they're dotted all over the place. And the proof that they're sort of natural, because so often people say, oh, you're lucky at Walton Heath, sandy soil and heathland soil and everything. We're actually on clay, which people find a lot of trouble with. Okay, we have a little bit of loamy topsoil, but then you're onto clay. Our clay has a lot of flints in it. And that has the effect of breaking it up. And I remember the old greenkeeper years ago saying, well, you've got the flints and then you've got over the years, the water's found ways to find its way across to get to these fissures because the chalk of the North Downs is just down there, not very far below the clay. And you'll never, ever see any water in the bottom of any of these solution hollows. For instance, one or two of them have been used to create sand bunkers. So in front of the 11th green on the new, there's one with sand in the bottom. You never, ever see water there. There's another one on the 14th of the new, again, sand, but never see water because the bottom of the solution hollow is the chalk. So it totally avoids the clay. And he used those whenever possible. The one thing he didn't note, he didn't use, it always sort of amuses me somewhat, is that on the 4th of the old, there is a natural dew pond up there. And if you're going to be playing on there this afternoon, so there is a natural. Now, the bunker in the middle of that fairway, is that a natural solution hollow or not? I'd have to pass on that. But level with that, on the left-hand side, there is a pond. And I bet if somebody had come along years later with the fashion of any sort of water hazards being part of golf courses, they would have incorporated that. But he never incorporated that. He just left that on one side.
You don't approve with the modern affectation of water hazards. Huh?
Yeah.
And that they shouldn't exist on golf courses?
Am I suggesting they shouldn't? No, goodness me, I wouldn't be so fundamental as that. I mean, you've got the Swilcombe burn, haven't you?
That's somewhat natural.
That's natural. Yeah.
I understand that Cosmo didn't hang on to Walton Heath for too long after the old was completed.
No, that just shows you that his interest wasn't. And in fact, the whole development was in his son's name, who tragically got killed in the First World War, and all the sort of, if you like, inheritance planning. His name was Malcolm Bonzer. It all went sort of sideways because it was inherited by his wife's family. Once he could see the thing was set up, and it was very successful from the word go, because here we are, saying that they were thinking of a second. The reason they wanted a second golf course was because of the numbers. So he was perfectly happy to sell out to George Riddell, who became Sir George, who then became Lord Riddell of Walton Heath. And he was the main man, but he had somebody called Kennedy, who was an engineer by profession. And of course, he had Hudson, who was the creator of Country Life. Country Life started in 1897. So the three of them were the shareholders, and I think Bonzer was perfectly happy to be out of it by then.
And Fowler would resign his secretaryship in 1911 to devote more time to course design, presumably using the success of the old course here.
Yeah, but he remained managing director.
Yeah. I noted with interest that there was an attempt to gain royal status in 1911.
Yeah, promoted by Winston Churchill.
Who was a member. But it didn't work. And I think the reasons given were, will you give it to Walton? We'd have to give it to a lot of other places. And I seem to remember the Berkshire came a cropper on that as well at one point, for the very same reason, that if we give it to the Berkshire, then I have to do it here, there and everywhere.
A lot of people think that, and there's that famous story about the Prince of Wales going into the clubhouse at the Berkshire with Archie Compston, and he was told, no, we don't have pros in the clubhouse. And with that, the Prince of Wales took the royal title away. But that, I don't believe there's a thread of evidence of that it was never royal. Okay, it was built on royal land, etc. But then we're in this extraordinary position whereby Riddell and his cohorts, but actually Riddell, I think the others were very much minor partners in the whole affair, but it was definitely Riddell's fiefdom, and he didn't believe in club captains. Why do you want the club captain? I think he would only ever get in the way of him.
He might have a point.
The despot. Yeah. And it wasn't until he died in 34 and the Carr family took over, and they could see that it would be a good thing to have a club captain, and they asked the then Prince of Wales to become the captain. He and his brother, the then Duke of York, were both honorary members from sort of quite a few years back. So he was known to play golf here, and he became captain in the summer of 35. And come January 36, his father, George V, died, and it was a case of the king is dead, long live the king, the new king being Edward VIII. Yeah. And he was our captain. Yeah. And very interestingly, so we've got this proud boast about being having a royal, having the king as captain of the club. And we were the only such club. But then somebody pointed out that in 1935, he'd become captain of the Royal Burgess. So I had to change the script at that stage to refer to the only English club. But then fast forward a few more years, I learnt that he actually resigned from the Burgess when he became, that was something that he had to give up. But interestingly, he didn't give up here. And my suggestion is because he actually used to come and play here, whereas he wouldn't have that much time to get up to Scotland. So somebody said to me when we were preparing the club history, well, what happened to his brother when he, and this would be the Duke of York, who became George VI. So, because they were both members, I've already told you. And I thought, well, what did happen to his brother? So he abdicated and his brother became king. What about his membership of Walton Heath? And I remember going straight, I was going through the clubhouse, somebody sprung this on me, and I thought this seems extraordinary that it's never occurred to me. So in the Fowler room, the private dining room, we've got a number of early members' handbooks, and this is the bit where I have to sort of blush somewhat. So I go to a late 30s handbook. Now, where do I find the king? So I look up under K. So I'm blushing. K for king. Well, needless to say, K for king is not there. But the amazing break that we had in me being particularly stupid is that there was R.T. Jones, Bobby Jones, as a member of the club. Atlantic Athletic Club, Atlanta, Georgia, USA. We had completely and utterly, and we were due to publish this book. This is our centenary history, published in 03. So I'm going back to, the very early 2000s that this cropped up. We had got a story about Bobby Jones coming to play golf here, but we'd completely lost sight of the fact that he'd have been a member. I find this actually quite scary that in a golf club, people move on and stuff gets forgotten about. So, by the way, I then go to the front of this little handbook, and there is patron King George VI. So very interesting. Not only did we have the king as captain, but his brother remained as patron, and one presumes he remained patron until he died in the early 50s.
It just goes to show you, as you rightly point out, that things get forgotten. People pass on, people pass away, people leave clubs. And there is that quote that you have on your email, that tradition is the, help me here, tradition is the...
Not the worship of ashes, but the preservation of fire.
There we go. I wanted you to say that. How important, obviously, just generally speaking, how do we, presumably it's not just here, it's everywhere. How can we do it better in terms of telling the story and hanging on to the story, whatever those stories are?
Yeah. Hugely important, I believe, because the whole sort of ethos of the game, the way the game is played, it's only played because of what's happened in the past and the way people have conducted themselves. And, the traditions and the history of it doesn't really matter. Any club, okay, Walton has had a very interesting history and there's perhaps more to talk about or display or do whatever, but every club has its own tale to tell. And I think it's just enormously important for members of those clubs to be reminded of what's happened along the way and that they're only enjoying this club, wherever that might be, because of what's happened in the past. And I think in a more broader sense, for instance, one can't avoid Braid. Well, just across there is his pro shop over the fence. And he was here for 46 years. He came here in 1904 when it was opened, and he was still in office as the pro in 1950 when he died. And then so many people are familiar with the triumvirate who totally dominated the Open Championship for the 20 years prior to the First World War, winning it 6 times, Varden winning it 6 times, and Taylor and Braid 5 times each. But they conducted themselves so admirably. Here they were, humble folk, leaving school at age 12 and having to get on with their lives. And I think golf gave them something very special, but on the other hand, they gave something back that's perhaps even more special. In other words, the way they conducted themselves. And then I think it goes on from there. It's the whole thing has grown up, but it's because people have conducted themselves. I mean, how many games do you call the penalty upon yourself? I mean, can you imagine the footballers having to call the penalty on themselves? I mean, it would be totally, utterly impossible.
They have enough trouble with the VAR, let alone calling penalties on themselves,
But that whole spirit, I mean, it is quite extraordinary.
Yeah.
It's just a shame that our forefathers, so they have done some wonderful stuff, but what a great shame it was that they didn't dictate where you teed the ball up subsequent to playing the previous hole. Because when I explained to people in Rule 1 in 1744, when they had the playing of the Silver Club for the first time, the Honourable Company, or what became the Honourable Company of Edinburgh Golfers, you should tee your ball up within 1 club length of the previous hole. Well, okay, that turned out to be not totally practical because of all sorts of reasons you can immediately think of, not least of all the wear and tear on the area immediately around the hole. So it became 2 club lengths and 3 club lengths and 4 club lengths. And I think it was only in the 1880s there was mention of a teeing ground. But what a shame they didn't subscribe that you had to tee the ball up within 25 yards. I mean, even in these sort of health and safety days, I would think if you were 25 yards to one side of the green, you should be by and large safe. And then they wouldn't have been able to extend all these golf courses. If they'd had that limitation, they would have to have kept, and that would have meant keeping the ball down so that it didn't fly.
But the greatest litmus test or acid test on that was when they started the tiger-proof golf courses in response to what Woods was doing. Earl Woods was just laughing at them, going, "You're playing into his hands." So it's just, I guess golf is often a game of opposites.
Yeah.
And you're almost better off doing the opposite of what you think the solution is. As in, obviously hit down to make it go up, swing left to make it go right, but make him shorter. Don't make him longer. Yeah. Because it precipitated everything,
Yeah. And they haven't made, I'm sure you could hit lots and lots of balls much further than but they haven't changed the size of the court or the size of the field or whatever, because there wasn't any need. You had to make sure the equipment was such that you couldn't...
There's actually a nice little sachet into where I want to go next, which is actually going back to the Haskell ball, which was obviously introduced by Coburn Haskell, I think, in 1898 in the States. Needless to say, a lot of our hero, Mr. Fowler's best golf was played with a Haskell ball.
Yeah.
In fact, I think he set the course record, or equal the course record at the old course, maybe in the early 1900s at some point, with a Haskell. And obviously Sandy Hurd had won the Open in the early 1900s as well with a Haskell. And needless to say, I think he was a proponent of the ball. In fact, he would become a director of the British Haskell Company, as it were. Not only for Fowler himself, but obviously for his contemporaries Colt and indeed Braid and Varden and Taylor. You know, many of the clubs were considering possible revisions as a result of the increased distance the ball was going.
Yes, he did have that financial, but like so many of his financial interests, they weren't, because that company never got off the ground, did it? I don't think. The one that's featured, we've got the advert.
Yeah. You'd know more about that than I would.
Yeah. But the other thing, you know, there's an article that he wrote about the follies of the ball being hit further and further, and you would think that was written in today. Yeah. It was absolute word perfect for today's situation. So it's been going on for all this time, and nobody's done anything about it. Because this constantly lengthening of golf courses, it's just should be totally unnecessary, and the cost in this sort of these sustainable days.
But it's funny, like it's less interesting now than perhaps it was. You know, people say, the fans like watching the golfers hit a big ball. Yet, when the highlight reel is shown, it's not the big ball, unless it's Dustin Johnson driving at 430 yards onto the green in Hawaii. But it's up and down, it's escape shots, it's, you know, plugged lies that go in. It's, you know, it's the unusual and the escapology stuff as opposed to the big ball. So, you know, the proof of the pudding is in the eating. And if the eating and it's the highlights reel, which doesn't show the big ball, then what are we doing? Yeah. Really, and it's almost like keeping up with the Joneses, that so and so is down the road is doing it, so therefore you must do it. And it's ultimately, for even if you're talking about hosting a tournament on a members' golf course, it's the members that are paying for it ultimately for one or two events a year. Yeah. And you know, I don't think they're going far enough in terms of rolling the ball back. I think that's just going to be a status quo scenario. But even if you look at, I was speaking to somebody recently who was speaking to a club somewhere, it'll remain nameless, but they have a high profile pro, come there once or twice a year, and the owner wanted to put tees in at 7,900 yards. And the person in question, who knows their stuff, goes, "What are you doing?
Yeah.
You're just wasting money.
Yeah. Crazy.
You don't need it.
Crazy.
You know?
Yeah.
Like, we'll put some AstroTurf back there if you want to facilitate them.
Yeah.
But it's just...
No, it doesn't make any sense. I have to say, coming out of the closet, I find watching... In fact, I don't really watch... People say, well, because we don't have Sky. Although I have a facility to get Sky, and I did have Sky for a bit. And I just found it, quite honestly, deadly boring. The only time it can get a little bit exciting is right at the very, very end. But by that stage, I've usually gone to sleep. When it gets into a match play situation. And I think if there was more match, I absolutely love watching match play golf, either on the television or better still live. The moment you see the first shot, you can join at any game, at any stage of the proceedings, and that shot counts because there is a competition on that hole to see who's going to win that hole, and it goes on from there. But a round after round of stroke play, deadly tedious.
You can see, I certainly know in Ireland, a lot of the major amateur events who have a tradition of match play have just gone to stroke play because it's easier. It doesn't take as long. You know, there's not as much of an impingement upon the members that are hosting. And they're going, you've actually lost some of the character of the competition if it's match play, you know? Because, and yes, it does take a little bit longer, whittling it down to 64 and, 2 rounds of stroke play to do that, and qualifying maybe before that. But like, that's part of what that competition is. So hang on to it, There's a quote here from Ran Morissette, who obviously you were in touch with, and it says, after Fowler completed his extensive work at Royal North Devon in 1907, the case can be made that he was the primary architect of the finest seaside course in Royal North Devon and the finest inland course at Walton Heath in the UK. And going back to that point, that it's fair to say he doesn't receive the recognition that he deserves. Obviously the likes of Colt and Mackenzie just about are active at this point in time. But why is it, do you think, that sort of looking back and from a historical perspective, maybe it could be argued that, not that but people say Colt is the father of golf course architecture, obviously very prolific with all the tentacles that he has. Fowler perhaps maybe was not quite as prolific, but probably as important.
Yeah, I remember talking to Donald Steele ages ago, and saying, I always have to remember Colt, because after all, Colt had a lot to do with Rye in 1892. I think I'm right in saying that. 1892, he was a local solicitor, Hastings, a young chap, past captain of Cambridge University Golf Club and everything else. And I said, clearly, he was into it that much earlier than Fowler. Okay, Fowler's first course opens in 2004. We know he was talking about it, thinking about it, and perhaps actually doing stuff about it turn of the century, say 1899, 1900. So Donald stopped me in my tracks. He said, no, you don't have to think along those lines, because 1892, yes, he had something. Colt, there's no record of Colt doing anything until he gives up being the solicitor and he applies to get the job at the R&A, doesn't he? As a secretary, fails that, finishes up at Sunningdale, and that's sort of 1900. So there's no reason to think that Colt was ahead of Fowler, which it's just coming from Donald, who must know what he's talking about. So why didn't he become as prolific as Colt? One can only speculate. And it might have had something to do with the fact that Fowler felt that he didn't need to, going back to his roots, being the heir to this huge fortune, which sadly, sort of for his sake at least, that fortune dissipated. Did he really, really need? But going against that argument, what about going out to America, the west coast of America, 5 days on a train? Yeah. But perhaps that was much more of an adventure for him. So I don't think we shall ever know, because Colt is hugely better known than Fowler.
Did he have any specific principles in terms of design? Obviously, we've already said that he'd no one style per se, but what sort of principles do you think he had in relation to how he approached course design?
Yeah, I've tried to get as many quotes in the book about these, like, sort of bullet points, and we came across really quite a lot. Hazards, bunkers. He was famous for his deep, deep, deep bunkers. But I do have to remind people that he also said that the golfer should have every chance of getting out in one, and it should only be a penalty of one, subject to that golfer playing a proper bunker shot. But very importantly, he should be able to play that shot from the flat bottom of the bunker. So this fashion now of filling the bunkers up with lots and lots of sand and raking the sand up the faces, you get the balls not necessarily actually plugging on those slopes immediately but below the faces, but not rolling back. So I think this is one of the reasons, and dare I say that, I have pointed this out to the guys at the golf club here at Walton Heath. More and more clubs are not raking the slopey bits of the bunkers. they're letting the weather just beat that down, so the ball won't rest on that sand. It will come back. In fact, I think the first place I saw that and complimented upon the then Secretary, Roger Murat, was at New Zealand. Suddenly you saw the flat areas on the slopey sides of the bunkers. So that was something he felt strongly about. And I think we have to remind people that you should have a chance, but because when you're on the slopey bits immediately below the revetting, or if it hasn't got revetting, we got these heather face bunkers, you can't actually get out in one. You can't do it. And that would upset. I love the other thing about how that if you're going to make a natural slope, because building a bunker, you throw the earth up, and and he and Colt and others, they were the great ones for blending their hazards into the natural landscapes. And he said that if you're going to have one of these hillocks, these slopes, run them out so that you can't actually see where they end. And we've got some wonderful, what I call Fowler earthworks out on the golf course here, and many of which have actually been discovered because so often where these bunkers sort of were finally finishing, the gorse took over and greenkeepers didn't bother. And we've taken some of the gorse out. You play the fourth on the old Walton, and you've got the bunkers, not greenside, because he wasn't such a great one for he didn't like pairs of bunkers. Typically, a club will have a pair of bunkers. He didn't like that. He liked to have them asymmetrically. What was the word? Can't remember just for a moment. It'll come back to me in a moment. And you see these bunkers, you've got the bunker close to the fairway, obviously, and then they drift off. The banking of them just drifts off, very often coming round, and then finally it sort of disappears. So it's all making it as natural as possible. Very interesting. When he came to build the second 9 of the new course, which we talked about a little earlier, when we wrote the history, we didn't have this quote, but came across it in Country Life comparatively recently. It's in the Fowler book, where it had come to his notice that the members and their invited guests were relying too heavily on the running game round the old course, because, that sort of so-called golden age of golf course architecture, they'd got rid of this idea of it being a steeplechase where you threw up these barricades so that if it was a bogey 5, you had 2 barricades to get over. They'd put, by this stage, the bunkers on the side. And there he was. And again, here's a sign of Fowler not bothering about sort of current fashions. He was the man and he did what he felt was best. So he says in this article that this is the second 9, so holes 5 to 13 inclusive on the new course, he had introduced cross hazards of various nature. So the members can practice their pitch and stop shots. And if you go around those, and I won't go through them, each of them has got cross hazards or hazards in front of the green, where you could actually, until you get to the 18th on the old course, you could almost kick it round the old course. But you cannot do that on the new course, particularly on those middle holes, the second 9, if you like. So there he was going against what had become sort of the principles where you put your hazards on one side.
He came up with an article for the Illustrated London News in 1913 entitled The Ideal Golf Course, which illustrated this particular notional golf course to using a plasticine model, which I believe he would go on to use quite a bit. Of Eastward Ho and various other places, no doubt the Berkshire as well. More interesting thing about this, and what I took out of it, is basically a 1915 report by the Verdant Green in the Philadelphia Inquirer. And it appears that the plasticine model and article came in for deep study by none other than George Crump and William Smith, obviously of Pine Valley fame. Could it be that William Herbert Fowler could have provided Crump with initial inspiration for Pine Valley, which obviously started in 1913 and was completed post his death, actually, in 1918?
But that Verdant Green article, clearly that was a sort of nom de plume for somebody. Do we know who it was or not? I can't remember. But one of the frustrations about publishing this book is that I've never, ever got any feedback from Pine Valley. And this was supported by somebody in the book, one of my golf course architecture friends, who is attached to one of the famous clubs out in America. He had definitely heard the rumor about it, because I felt when that note, it is in the book, came through, that sort of supported the view. So it's a frustration, because it is Colt that so often given the credit, isn't it? That, he visited. Derek went into a huge amount of research into seeing if there was any evidence of Fowler visiting Pine Valley, but that there is no evidence. But when this article came up that Crump was using picture of the model for the ideal course, yes, it's currently, we just don't know, but I can't imagine how that guy, Verdon Green, sort of dreamt it up.
Partnerships, and certainly in terms of around that time that ideal golf course article was done, obviously it's just prior to the First World War, and the demand for new golf courses in Britain and beyond was almost insatiable. Obviously that would be a stop would be put to that particular gallop during the Great War. But I believe in 1913, Fowler announced the formation of a formal partnership with Tom Simpson. Now, and I do have plans to do one of these series with Jeff Styles on Simpson. But I believe Fowler was the main instigator of the partnership. What can you tell us about why perhaps Simpson was chosen? Not quite his muse, but I do understand that by this stage Simpson had been consulting several clubs in Ireland, and Fowler may have inadvertently said something that was taken up the wrong way. But I digress. Why do you think he thought a partnership with Simpson was a good idea?
Oh, actually, sure. I mean, I would think sort of workload. Don't forget, when Fowler went out to the west coast of the States, breaking this new ground, that was in 20. He was already into his 60s by then. I think I'm right in saying that. Yes, he was, because they couldn't get over how well he still played. So yeah, that's right. And by the mid-30s, he was 80, and I think Saunton, which was his last course, he was 80 then, and then he died in the early 40s. So I think he was at 83 or 4 by then. So yeah, I would think it was the natural thing where he needed a business partner. My guess is Simpson must have admired his work. I mean, we all know that story, and I know this story is in the book about him, because he was in the law, wasn't he? And he came to Woking and he saw this bunker being put in the middle of the fourth fairway, and was sort of inspired by this, that there was something to this golf course architecture. And I suppose he was in a position, because he came from a wealthy family, didn't he, Simpson?
We're kind of birds of a feather in that regard,
Yeah, I would think so.
I mean, apropos the opportunity that existed in the States, obviously partnering with Simpson, that allowed Fowler to devote more attention and energy in that particular direction. I believe there appeared to be some jealousy or certainly disquiet amongst the likes of C.B. Macdonald and various other, Donald Ross perhaps as well. This is probably more to do with the amateur question.
Yeah, I was going to say that's got to be the main reason.
Yeah, well, you might explain the differences. Obviously, Fowler was, Fowler was involved in the definition of the amateur status from an R&A perspective with John Lowe and Horace Hutchinson back in 1910, which obviously essentially spoke about caddies and golfers who earned their money from golf. There was no mention of club makers or indeed golf course designers. Whereas poor old Francis Wemay, who won the US Open in 1913, had his amateur status taken off him for setting up a minor sports apparel business. Did get it back though in 1919, but. And ultimately, the USGA adopted the R&A's definition in 1931. So all's well that ends well, but internecine power struggles.
Yeah. And the fact that he would have come over as a pretty arrogant sort of chap. There's that marvelous photograph we got in the book of him sitting on the steps of a golf club in a white, was it a white jacket and rather a splendid Panama hat? But he was sort of, even sitting down, he was towering over them all. And I, yeah, and the fact that he over there he would have been deemed a professional, whereas over here, he was a gent and had all the sort of attributes of a gent, which must have thoroughly upset the Americans. There's no doubt about it that you're not going to go out to the west coast of America without some sort of excellent whole list of contacts, and it was Douglas Grant. This character.
It's the wool guy, yeah? Was he wool?
No, oil. Wasn't he a great...
Oil? Oh, sorry, yes. There was
he was heir to a great oil fortune,
yeah.
And he'd had an unfortunate marriage. And the girl that he met, the Rutherford girl, whose family lived just opposite here, interestingly, there's no evidence of... There's evidence of him playing here, but not actually a member. I think he was a member of... Richmond Golf Club at Sudbrook Park, not to be confused with the Royal Mid-Surrey. But anyway, he was a prolific and played a lot of Surrey County golf and played a lot of golf and married the Rutherford girl. And he would have given Fowler a whole load of introductions. It's amazing. I mean, he had those 2 visits, 20 and 21, didn't he? But the work that is put to his name in California is extraordinary for such a short period of time.
Presumably, Carter's seeds were quite. I mean, Carter's seeds seem to crop up over and over again over in the States, both in terms of Mackenzie and Colt, and obviously now Fowler as well. They sort of used him as a calling card to sell seed, and he kind of used them a little bit in terms of additional contacts, perhaps.
What, Fowler working in conjunction with the Carters? Yeah. Is that in the book?
No, I'm just trying to pull things together.
No, well, it wouldn't surprise me because poor fellow, he was always so short of money. Okay, he had this sort of other arrogant, very sort of well-to-do look about him, owing money to every smart London shop, and so on and so forth. So any small commercial gain that he could think of, I think, was grasped at.
And we touched on this briefly earlier on, the Los Angeles Country Club, which obviously hosted the US Open last year. He appeared to have a pretty good working relationship with 2 of the founders and directors, Joseph Sartori and Edward Tufts. Just wondering, first of all, is that Tufts anything to do with Pinehurst Tufts?
No, I've asked that, and no, there wasn't. It's an unusual name.
An unusual name, but that was the first thing that jumped out to me when I read it.
And of course, that was that famous letter that we got with 72-page document attached to it, which had a sketch of each of the 36 holes and an article about each of those holes, and the covering letter saying that Fowler, had got a huge amount of faith in, what's his name, Sartori?
Yeah.
And the manager there, and your member, George Thomas, to ensure that my plans are implemented. So this is Fowler's work, and there is Fowler saying to George Thomas, wealthy guy, done a bit of work, over on the East Coast, then came over to California, and there he is. And understandably, 8 years later, you've laid out all those golf holes. There's going to be something wrong with some of them. And of course, the one that they completely abandoned was the short little 17th called the Terror.
Which Gill put back in.
He's rebuilt, which is amazing. And I did write a nice note saying that nobody's rebuilt Fowler hole in its entirety to the best of my knowledge. So can you please just write a little bit about it? So he was very kind in writing that. Uh-huh. And now actually the LA Country Club has now got 37 holes. So there's that little hole that you can play if you want between playing the 17th green and the 18th tee, and that's apparently they do play it as an extra hole.
Have you seen it?
Have I?
Have you seen the rebuilt little Terry yet? As in, have you played it?
No, I did go out to watch the Walker Cup. And it wasn't, it must have been between then and, yeah. No, I'm sure I would have remembered if I'd seen it. No.
Okay. And I believe it was more disquiet with Robert Hunter, in fact, who would obviously go on to become the local California partner to Dr. Mackenzie. He was so disturbed by Fowler's progress in the USA that he contacted Walter Travis.
Oh, yes.
What can you tell us about that? And I think in an effort to lure him to California to perhaps have a shootout or something.
Yeah. Isn't he wrote the letter to
Travis.
Travers.
Yeah.
But Travers didn't make too much of it, did he?
Didn't come out until 18 months later. So
yeah.
It wasn't obviously too much of a concern for Travis.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, well, that was I don't know whether there were any long-term consequences of that. I doubt. That was just somebody.
So Pebble Beach's 18th is obviously now a renowned picture-perfect par 5. It was at one point par 4.
Yeah.
Mr. Fowler may have had something to do with extending it to a par 5.
I think he's credited it with it, isn't he? And he did a lot of work there, but I think it was the sort of main legacy, if you like.
And before he finished up in the States, Eastward Ho, the Cape Cod links style golf course. I was interested to read an article that Ron Morissette had up on Golf Club Atlas with Bill Healy, who's a long-time member and I think perhaps the club historian.
And has written about the golf course, yeah.
Sounds like a wonderful place.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
Figure of 8 routing with the golf, with the clubhouse in the middle.
Yeah.
Atlantic views and inland views and as near to a links golf course as they have in the States, maybe.
Yeah, sadly, they did ask me to their centenary celebrations, but it was just at the tail end of COVID and the travelling was very, very difficult and we were only going to ever get out there for a long weekend and you heard the people getting delayed. So sadly, one of my regrets, I don't really do regrets, but that was a shame and I'd still love to get out there because they revere Fowler. And they took a lot of the books. And my great frustration was that we did the whole book thing as a labour of love. It was a not-for-profit thing, so there was no way we could give it any we sold it at the price that it cost us, so we couldn't give any discounts to local pros. But Eastwood Ho took a whole lot of them. The LA Country Club, because quotes from the pro, we couldn't make our profit margin. It didn't have a single book.
Wow.
There's a very nice elderly, even older than me, quite a bit older than me, I think, archivist, Adrian Whitted, Whitted, who has, thank goodness, he has got the Fowler connection and he's done an awful lot over the years to promote it. So they do have a Fowler trophy at the LA Country Club, for instance. But George Thomas seems to remain supreme. And this is what's inclined to happen. So having got involved with one of the early golf course architects, as I have done, they do get airbrushed out. If there's a more fashionable architect that's come along and done the work, then that architect is the guy that's quoted. But they forget about the guy who actually did the original routing, if you like, as they say over the other side.
But one that immediately comes to mind is Hallamshire. Hallamshire in Sheffield.
Yeah, wonderful golf course.
And that's attributed to Colt, as far as I was concerned.
Is that really right?
But Fowler was obviously part of Colt.
No, I've now tried to play, and you've got Abbeydale also in Sheffield. I've now played those two. I've only got 2. There's the 34 clubs that we recognised as where Fowler had a substantial involvement. I have tried to get round to them all. And surely Hallamshire is a classic example of somebody having the guts to sort of realize, well, you could get a golf course on this bit of land. Have you played there?
I haven't played.
It's up and down. Yeah. Lost so many balls, I remember, which is always a sign of how difficult it is. I can go for weeks out here without losing a ball. So I suppose I'm quite good at finding them in the heather. But no, classic Hallamshire, wonderful golf course. But it would be appalling to think that somebody else was being given the credit for it.
But I suppose it comes back to that restoration piece. What are you restoring? Are you restoring it back to this year range or that year range or whatever's convenient? Or
yeah. But certainly there seems to be a trend, doesn't there, whereby they are recognizing, the Mackenzie and Ebert, the first thing they did when we appointed them golf course architects, they came up with their historical review. Wonderful document. Okay, I was able to give them a bit of help, but they'd done an awful lot from their own facilities, and they clearly attach a lot of importance to the history of a club or the history of a golf course, and certainly wanted to sort of develop that rather than destroy it. And I know they're busy, but I'm sure they're very often being appointed. I mean, the best thing that's ever happened, in my mind, at Walton Heath is the fact that we've now appointed an official golf course architect. Because, okay, I suppose we had Fowler. There was no need when all the whilst Fowler was here. There is no evidence at all of Braid having any involvement. So here he was doing, what are we up to? Braid and his 500 golf courses or something, hugely prolific. But I reckon he felt he knew his place here. He was the pro here, and with Fowler always around. Albeit, by the time the late 30s, Riddell had gone, the Carr family were in place by then, and they could see that we needed to change some holes on the old course. Largely, I mean, you raised the business earlier on about the arrival of the Haskell ball. 1902, Hurd winning the Open, and there was Fowler in the middle of these big plans for his golf course at Walton, and he certainly finished up with two 250-yard holes. And the very, very first one that was changed was the 10th hole, because there was no problem with the land beyond it, because the golf course at that stage took a right-angled turn, so they could just extend the 10th. But the other hole, which was the 5th hole, was the 250-yard hole, was followed immediately by this wonderful short hole, the 6th hole, which was an absolute classic short par 3. So they had the courage finally at the end of the 30s to merge those two holes together, and then they built the new 6th and 7th holes to get back on the line. But that was to do with extending holes. Where were we? We were. I've gone off the piste, and I can't remember.
Okay, we'll get you back with a question then. So how about that?
Yeah.
So August 23, the Fowler and Simpson partnership would be extended to Fowler, Abercrombie, Simpson and Croom.
Yeah.
Who were these Messrs. Abercrombie and Croom?
Gosh. Well, Abercrombie was known, wasn't he? He was it Walperston? Gosh, it's in the book, isn't it? Certainly went to Addington. And then, although we credit Noel Park, I think he had quite a lot to do with Noel Park. I mean, Abercrombie wasn't prolific by any manner of means, was he? He just had a handful, and I think he sort of settled at the Addington with its two wonderful golf courses. And that, as for Croom, he only is credited with one golf course, isn't it? That's Liphook. And
correct, yeah.
He was an ex-schoolmaster, Radley schoolmaster, I think, and he did a bit of journalism, and he wrote, and I think he definitely came along, I think, more to sort of run the office.
He was the PR man, by the looks of it.
Yeah, I think so.
And you're right, it was Worplesdon.
Yeah.
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 And it's funny, there was a publication released, and they had a piece in there saying, unfortunately, our best land schemes are often defeated by the committee who manage the course after we have finished our work. Putting greens are often reduced in size and fairways narrowed, just for the sake of economy and upkeep.
Yeah.
They all appeared not to enjoy committees.
Yeah.
Pretty much across the board. I think that's kind of a common enough denominator.
Simpson, he used to have his driver in his Rolls Royce driving backwards and forwards in front of the committee room. Now, I tell you what we were onto, and I got lost a bit. The importance of appointing a golf course architect.
Yes, sorry, beg your pardon.
Yeah, that is huge. I think this is aimed at every golf club in the land, because the damage that's done by enthusiastic and usually chairman of the green committee who thinks that they can leave their mark. I mean, the damage, and Walton Heath sadly is no exception to this. And I did that particular job as a young man way back in the 70s and wouldn't have dreamt of doing anything, and wouldn't dream now of ever doing anything. Because what do I know, or indeed anybody else know, about golf course architecture compared with people who are making a job of it? So, okay, we had Fowler, so there was no need. We did have to call in somebody when Fowler was very old, in the late 30s, somebody called Tippett, who'd had a bit of experience. He went on down to Rye because he didn't get his job back here after the war, but that's another story. And then we've had a succession of people, and we had the owners. I mean, the owners, the Carr family, and the second hole on the old is it's still a marvelous hole, but the very rough ground that runs in front of both 18th tees and indeed the second tee of the new old flint pits went right across that fairway, and you couldn't hit your drive too far because you got into the rubbish. Okay, now perhaps you could only, I don't know, take a 6-iron, but what they've lost is a 200-plus yard shot from a hanging lie to a green all that distance away. And quite honestly, unless you put some sort of hazard, some reason why the good golfer can't just hit it as far as he wants, unless you put something in place, you'll never get a 200-yard shot to a par 4. So that was that's down to William Larnes. And there are a number of other things. Planting trees. I mean, the thought of planting a tree on Walton Heath, I think we're completely out of that now. But on the other hand, trees have been planted within living memory, certainly. So the most important thing is to decide who it is that is going to be your golf course architect. And anything that, I mean, after all, there's no harm in members having an idea. It might be a very good idea. It might be something that nobody's ever thought of, and it would make all the difference. But it must go through your appointed golf course architect. I feel absolutely passionately about this. I remember years and years ago coming across one club history where the privilege of the captain every year is to make one course alteration. So can you imagine the mismatch that you finish up with? I mean, that is absolutely mind-bending.
Well, you might end up with fountains and water features and revetted bunkers, perhaps. I know that's a touchstone for you.
Don't get me onto that. Yeah, we've done very well chatting here for quite a time, and we haven't got it onto the disastrous revetted bunkers.
I spent some time in the Netherlands last year and engaged with a course convener. And they've got an interesting model in relation to the links, or the course, shall we say. And they separate out the history and the course from perhaps maybe the political machinations, because the story is the story, warts and all, and the course is the course.
Yeah.
And they sort of adopt the approach that actually having somebody or people involved for a long period of time actually gives them a chance to actually develop a knowledge base and to pass it on and to develop real understanding. And actually, when they do a project, they audit it in typical Dutch fashion. If they make a mistake, they figure out why they made the mistake and they try not to make it again. And I think your stereotypical 2 or 3 year iterations of committees, there's never enough time to actually develop that experience base and the knowledge base and actually pass it on. And even you take the commercial world where, you'd never be appointed a director of a board if you didn't have the skill set or the interest. And if you didn't have the skill set or the knowledge, well, you'd be provided with a file of stuff to read in terms of introducing you to the topic, if nothing else. And we just fail to do that. Not everywhere, but...
Yeah. Actually, and there's no secret. I mean, I've written a paper, and anybody who's prepared, very welcome to look at it. But I just don't think in this day and age a golf club needs a green committee, because if you think of the standard of greenkeeping now is just so much better. It doesn't matter whether it's on a golf course. I think of all the soccer pitches where this time of the year, not now, but the end of the season, you just have a brown field with 4 little triangles of green at each corner. But you think of the magnificent surfaces they provide on a football pitch or a rugby pitch or wherever. But also the green, you've got this whole hierarchy. You've got a highly paid secretary or chief executive who then has the greenkeeper, and they have the agronomy, and then the golf course art. This team of highly paid, highly professional people. And then it's felt that you can have a bunch of members who might never have had anything to do, almost invariably won't have any knowledge of agronomy or anything else, but they so often think they do. And that's because they're in power at a golf club. I'm not aiming this necessarily at Walton, I'm just generally. Clearly, if it's a members club, the member must have some sort of conduit that he can push his ideas through, or whatever it is that's bothering him about the golf course. So there's got to be a line of communication, but that really should be done through the secretary or the chief executive or the board or the general committee. We have a board and we have a general committee here, and then we do have a green committee and we have a chairman of green. And they're all very good friends of mine, and I don't have any problems with any of them, but how can they possibly influence this group of highly paid professional advisors that we employ to look after our golf courses? I mean, I sit on Lorne Smith's Fine Golf. I'm on his advisory committee, but I made it quite clear that I know what I want in my golf courses, but I know nothing about and don't need to know anything about how we achieve it. But to feel that a bunch of unqualified members can actually have an impact is just, in my mind, was positively dangerous because of what can be done.
I know you've a cricket match to get to, so I have one final question and bring you back to Fowler. He would pass away in 1941. Obviously, Berkshire and Saunton been 2 of his last couple of courses. What do you think his legacy is to both here at Walton and in the wider golfing context?
Golly, well, I think his legacy is leaving some wonderful golf courses behind him, and his ability to spot where you can build a golf course and build a cracking good golf course is just something that he could be immensely proud of. And just creating wonderful places where people have carried on enjoying playing golf there.
I have one final question. I ask this of all my guests, and I'm just wondering if you could make 2 recommendations for anybody out there that may be looking to augment their golfing libraries. What 2 books should they look into purchasing?
Gosh, that is a fastball. Now here we are, surrounded by all these books. I would think the badminton library behind me there, first edition 1890. I mean, it just happened to be published at a time when it was the start of the Gulf explosion. And I think one of the many, many reasons given for the Gulf explosion is the arrival of the badminton library, because it's got everything about what was known about the game then. It's got the instruction. It's just, if you like, it's a sort of compendium. And it was a series of books about all the different sports. I think there were in the end, about 23 different sports were covered, including motoring, because, motoring was started, and I think looked at upon as a sport by many people in those really early days. So I would definitely recommend the Badminton Library. And okay, I suppose it would be considered an antiquarian book, but it went to many editions. So 1819, I think the last edition was 1911. So, albeit it's an early book, and really the really only reasonably available early book. So that's Head and Shoulders. And then you want another book, do you? I've got 4,000 or 5,000.
As he glances around the room at the voluminous.
Well, I suppose I think it would have to be. I was going to say Darwin or Longhurst, and Longhurst is actually much more easily read than, so his compendium volume, My Life and Soft Times. But I don't think Henry would approve of me putting himself in front of Bernard Darwin. So I would have thought Bernard Darwin wrote 3 biographies. The first one was Green Memories. The second one was Pack Clouds Away. There were 2 books that were published during the war, Pack Clouds Away, and I think it's that one. And then the last one, which was much later in his life, The World That Fred Made. And The World That Fred was the stable boy because he lost his mother at childbirth. So his father, Francis Darwin, went sort of back to live at home with the famous Darwin, Charles Darwin. And, he was a little boy in a very, very grown-up household, but Fred was the stable boy. So he thought The World of Fred, and actually his last book was The World That Fred Made. So one of those 3, I think you've got to have read a bit of Darwin to really get to grips with Gulf literature, and quite difficult to read, because I think he was deemed to be one of the great English essayists, and he wrote all sorts of other stuff than just Gulf. But because it's such perfect English, you don't often come across it. But,
and he wrote Braid's biography as well, didn't he?
Absolutely, yeah. The only biography that he wrote of a golfer, and he definitely knew Braid very well and had a lot of regard. Not least of all, I think, was because when he gave the bar up, the bar, he was a barrister at the bar. And I think we're talking about 1910. And the very first Open Championship that he went to see was it's 08, not 10. 08, he went up to Prestwick to watch, and he followed Braid round. And this was the first round of that championship, 1908 at Prestwick. And he went round in 72. And that was sort of an unheard of score. And then subsequently, Braid won it, and he won it with a record score of 291. And I think that had a profound impact on Darwin. Darwin had never seen golf played like that before. And I think they became great friends. And we've got this lovely little exhibition. It's entirely photographic, so the door is open all day. If you're coming to Walton, you must go to that exhibition. And towards the end, it records the fact that Braid had 18 holes in one, which was pretty remarkable in itself. But even more remarkable that he had a 2 at every hole at Walton Heath.
Jesus.
And people did sort of query this when the exhibition was opened. And it comes from Darwin's book. And I honestly don't think Darwin would have quoted that unless he'd heard it from the great man.
It's amazing.
So I'm perfectly happy about that.
Well, listen, on that note, I will check out the photographic exhibition while I'm waiting for Mr. Panel. I just wanted to say thank you very much for extending your time to me this morning. It's been an absolute delight. I hope we get to chat again. You're very self-deprecating, but who would be interested in what I have to say? You're a mind full of stories, and I just thank you very much for
You're very kind. I hardly recognise the person to whom you're referring. Thank you.
No problem. Thanks a million.
Many thanks for tuning in. We really do hope you enjoyed the show. If you don't yet follow us on Twitter, X, Instagram, or indeed our Substack account, you can do so at Firm and Fast Golf on X, at Firm and Fast Golf Podcast on Instagram, and at the Firm and Fast Golf Podcast Occasional Newsletter on Substack. Finally, if you're so inclined, you could leave us a star rating or even a review on your podcast platform of choice. It really would be appreciated. Until the next time, happy golfing.